let us consider the following. Like last lecture we had considered the GARCH model. Okay, and then that basically tells you that once you have been given a time series, at each point in the time series you can basically evaluate the variance. Okay, and that thing will help you to evaluate the variance at the next point using the returns of that particular point. Okay, also I talked about this maximal likelihood estimation. Okay, now the thing is, even though when I'm saying like I'm taking the GRCH model, GARCH model, or the ARCH model, okay, there are these parameters alpha, lambda, the sigma bar squared. Thing is, how would you estimate them? So the thing is, you could use the maximum likelihood estimator to estimate them. The way to do that is, the following. Okay, since the returns that we have, okay, this thing is a log normal process. The returns that we have will always be at any particular time point will always be chosen from a distribution which is a log normal distribution with a variance at that particular time which is given by sigma I. Okay, so the probability of seeing this bunch of returns in the time steps I is equal to 1 to n will basically be the multiplication of all these probabilities, because the returns at each time step are basically independent of the returns at the other time step in principle. Okay, so in case, because of this assumption that it's a log normal walk, the returns at any particular time step that are there are basically following a log normal are following this log normal distribution. I think so this thing should be sigma squared, sorry. Okay, so then once we have that, we are having this particular probability distribution of realizing this particular returns. So when you use maximum likelihood estimator, what you say is that what is the highest probability, what is the value of the parameters in this problem, which will give you the highest probability of realizing those returns. Okay, so the parameters in the problem are the alphas and the lambdas. Okay, at each particular time point that is there, you're evaluating the sigma I using the information of the sigma I at the previous time point and the return at the particular time point. Okay, that is how you evaluate the sigma i's. The ri's that are there are already given to you from the data, the historical the previous data that is there. And from that, what you will do is you will evaluate the values of sigma i's, which will basically be dependent upon the alphas, sigma dot, sigma star. There should be a square here. Okay, and lambda. Okay, so once you have this particular probability probability function, okay, which you have, which will be dependent on these parameters, all you try to do is, as in the previous case, evaluate the values of the parameters for which this particular probability becomes probability of realization of these returns turns out to be a maximum. Okay, and that is how, given the data points, how are you going to evaluate this particular alphas and the lambdas. Okay, and then as far as the GARCH model goes, as we have seen, in the future, in case you want to evaluate the value of the parameters in the future, what you will do is the expected values will obviously be having these relationships, because they're having these relationships. Once you have been given the alpha from the once you have given the alpha and the lambda and sigma squared from the past data, you're having the sigma at one particular point. In the future, if you want to evaluate it, you just iterate the series, and then you will get the sigmas, the variances at the volatilities at each particular time points in the future, in case you're playing with the GARCH model. Okay, so this is as far as that modeling goes. Okay, I would like to go to some tutorial problems now that are there. Okay, in the tutorial, the thing is, what I have in this one tutorial thing is, what we have been given is this pay later call option. Okay, the way this call option is defined, it's a European option. This has a payoff which is equal to maximum of s minus e 0 at time t as a normal European option, but the holder of the option that is there, he doesn't have to pay a premium to enter into the contract. Okay, but must pay q to the writer at expiry. That is also only if s is greater than equal to e. So they ask you what is the value of q. Okay, now this thing is just you could have the way you basically do it, one of the ways of doing this is you can do the following. At the entry, you basically get into a contract. Okay, and your portfolio is basically just a contract which, as is told to you, is having a zero value. Okay, at expiry, what is the value of the contract? At expiry, portfolio is basically s minus c S greater than 0 and 0 S smaller than E. Okay, so the thing is, just because you have holded this particular contract, okay, you're basically having a maximum profit of, you're basically having a profit which is max of S minus E comma 0. No arbitrage basically says that you cannot be making a free profit. So obviously whatever the amount that is there, you must paying to Q should basically just be equal to max of S minus E. Okay, this thing is just this problem is just like a queasy way of basically saying of trying to bring in the no arbitrage condition into solving the no arbitrage condition and framing a particular problem of this kind. Okay, so the fact that you cannot make a risk-free profit, okay, that means the obviously whatever money that you have, you will have to give it to the person from whom you are basically going to be getting this particular contract. Okay, that is, you are going to be buying the option, okay, or buying the asset at expiry, okay, the right to buy the asset, okay, so, or the guy who is the writer of the contract, I'm sorry, okay. So that is one problem. Another problem that is given to you is the range forward contract is specified as follows. At expiry, the holder must buy the asset for E1 if the value of the asset is smaller than E1, for S for the value of the asset itself if it lies between E1 and E2, and for E2 if the value of the asset is greater than E2. So they're asking you to find the relationship between E1 and E2 when the initial value of the contract is 0 and E1 is smaller than E2. Okay, E1 is smaller than E2 because that is what you're seeing from that condition itself. Now in case you want to price the value of the contract, okay, what we do is since finally you're having a this forward contract as we had done previously, okay, at least as far as the equation that it is going to follow is the same as the Black-Scholes equation, only the final condition is different. Okay, if you go back to your notes, we had actually solved the forward contract using the Black-Scholes methodology. So the equation that is there is the same. So because the equation is the same, the solution that is there will obviously be the same. So the solution that we know for any particular variable or any particular contract obeying the Black-Scholes equation is given by this formula, where this thing is the final condition. Okay, our final condition that is given to us is f s of t is S minus E. That is, this is this is the amount of profit that you will be making. So that is the value of the contract when S is smaller than E, is just equal to 0 when E is in this particular magnitude, S is in this particular magnitude, and is greater than E2. If S is greater than E2, this is the amount of profit you make. So that is the value of the contract, okay, at expiry. So that is the final condition. Once we have that, we just plug these, we plug these formulas over here. So when we are doing the integral, that is when you are doing it from 0 to infinity, so first of all you will do it from 0 to E1, where this particular number is just going to take the value S minus E1. Then you will do the integral from E1 to E2, ds prime going from E1 to E2, and there the value of the contract Fs is basically just equal to 0. And then finally you have an integral from S going S greater than E2 for all the integral that is happening for S prime greater than E2, where this particular thing is just S minus E2. Okay, so this is the value of this particular option, and this is how you will evaluate the value of this particular forward contract. Okay, so we have this particular numbers, we plug it them over here, okay, and then we use the fact that the value of this, what we have been told is the value of this contract is 0, the initial value of the contract is 0. Okay, so when you got inside the contract, that was at time t, okay, the value of the contract was equal to 0. So once you put that particular number over here, what you will get is just one condition between E1 and E2, because these are the only things which are going inside the evaluation, okay, other than the values of sigma and r, okay, and then afterwards you will basically be able to see that the factor of s that is there, you could basically cancel that out, and you will basically get a relationship between E1 and E2. Okay, or at least see that the value of s that is there is going to cancel out when you put this equal to 0, and you will just get a particular relationship between E1 and E2. Okay, find that particular relationship. Okay, so that is the second part of the problem. That is another problem. Now the third problem in the tutorial that I want to go through is this problem where they ask you to consider the option vega, that is how the option price at any particular time and asset value basically changes with the, how is the sensitivity to the volatility itself. they're asking you to prove that this obeys this expression. Okay, so option Vega, 1 second, this is how you write it. This thing is the expression for that. Okay, and what they're asking you to prove is they're asking you to prove the following expression. Okay, so the way to go forward is we'll start with the Black-Scholes equation. We know that the Black-Scholes equation exists. Then all we have to do is take the derivative with respect to phi, with respect to sigma, to get the v. Take the derivative with respect to sigma of this whole expression, and then afterwards what you can see is just this and this expression. Once you take the derivatives, you get this expression back. Okay, so this is what we get as far as these two problems go. Okay, now I would like to go towards new chapters. Okay, I would like to talk about exotic and path dependent options. Okay, exotics are harder to price and they're very risky, and hedging them in over here is the most important thing. Okay, these are two important facts, okay, about these options. Okay, as far as path dependent option goes, these are options which are dependent upon the path that the asset, or or the option on which this particular on the I would like to say underlying. Okay, the option, if it's on a particular underline, the path dependent options are dependent upon the path that the underlying basically took. For example, an Asian option, okay, has a payoff at expiry which is dependent upon the average value of the asset up until expiry. Okay, this is the path dependent option. Okay, because it's dependent upon the average value up till expiry. This is a strong path dependent option because now what you have is, whenever you're considering the value of the option, okay, there will be an actual extra parameter that is there. It is not just dependent upon the value of the asset at the particular time and the time at the where you're evaluating the option, but the average value that the option at the asset had over a past history since the time since you have got inside the contract. Okay, so because of that, you're basically bringing in one extra dimension in the problem. It is not just the value of the asset and time, the variables, but there is an extra variable in the problem, which is the average value of the asset. And whenever you're bringing extra variables in the problem, okay, that means this thing is called a strong path dependence, because you're using some information about the path that the option took, the particular values that the asset took at this particular point. Okay, there are certain things which are called the weak path dependent, and a weak path dependent option is, for example, a barrier option. Okay, for example, if you're talking about a knocked out barrier option, the way the knocked out barrier option works is, if the asset price anytime, for example, okay, let us consider the following. In case the barrier option is defined as follows: anytime the asset price was below 1000 rupees, the option remains valid. Okay, for entire time period in which the option was supposed to be until expiry, if the asset price was below 1000, the option was supposed to be valid. But anytime the asset value basically crosses 1000, the option basically becomes null. Okay, so this is also a particular option that you could have, okay, which is with such a definition that it's a barrier, that is, once it crosses the barrier, either over here in this particular case it's a knocked out option, that is, once it crosses the barrier, the option basically becomes invalid. There could be a knock-in option, that is, when the asset value goes above the particular value, that is only when the option basically becomes comes into play, that is, it becomes alive. Okay, so these are like various kinds of options which are only dependent on one particular point. They are not basically dependent on the history, like in the strong path dependence, but somewhere around the path, if something happened, then there is obviously a weak path dependence, because it is not dependent upon all the asset values, okay, in the path that the asset has taken, but it only depends upon one particular asset value where it basically crosses this particular barrier. That is why it is called weak path dependence. Okay, and because of that, there are no additional variables in this problem. Okay, now when we talk about exotic options, we could talk about there are various kinds of exotics. Okay, One of these exotics are compound and chooser options. Okay, so these are options basically on options. Okay, so they basically give you the right to buy or sell a particular option itself. Okay, so generally an option by its, which we had defined, like an European call was defined as an option to buy a particular asset or a security at a particular time in the future. Choosers would basically give you something else. They would give you the option to buy or sell an option itself in the future. Okay, so these are exotic options because they are the underlying that is there is itself an option. Okay, let us consider a compound option, a simple compound option, and let us study its valuation. Okay, suppose we had an underlying option which has a payoff fs at time t. Okay, so as I said, for a European option, the underlying was an asset. In a compound, in these kind of options, the underlying is a option itself. Let us say that option has a payoff of fs at time t. Okay, the compounded option can be expressed at, it is basically it can be expressed at a time tc0 smaller than t, such that it could be it could be exercised, okay, at this particular time. And when you exercise that particular time, you will get amount equal to g time vs of t c naught. Okay, where v that is there is the value of the underlying option. Okay, so what we see is that the exercise of value that is there of this particular option, the compounded option that is there, is dependent on the value of the underlying option that it takes at the exercise time of the compounded action. Okay, however, the underlying option itself has an exercise time well into the future. Okay, so once we have that, the Black-Scholes equation. Now the thing is, as far as the underlying option goes, it's just a normal option. Okay, it will when you're going to in order to evaluate the option, you will be basically doing a delta hedging. Okay, assuming that the Black-Scholes conditions work, and you will get a Black-Scholes equation for that. Okay, this Black-Scholes equation, every option option that is there comes with the final condition, and we have been given the final condition that the expiry is the time t. On this option, what we have is a compounded option. Let us call this compounded option C0. Since it is dependent upon the original option, on the underlying, which is an option, and that option itself is dependent upon S and T, that means the compounded option essentially is dependent upon S and T. Okay, the compounded option is dependent upon V, the underlying option, which itself is dependent upon S and T. So the compounded option itself is dependent upon S and T. Okay, so once we are having a compounded option, we are having some kind of a contract which is dependent upon S and T. We could do the same delta hedging to basically delta hedging at every time step. Okay, and then afterwards apply no arbitrage to get the Black-Scholes equation. Okay, and then what we have is this Black-Scholes equation. Anytime we are having a Black-Scholes equation, it comes with a final condition, and the final condition was given to us as g, which is dependent upon the value of the underlying option that we have at time tc0. Okay, so this is how we will evaluate this particular options. What we will do is we'll have the underlying option, evaluate that. We know the Black-Scholes method of evaluating that. There is that particular equation I also showed you in the tutorial right now. Evaluate that particular thing. Once we have a functional for this Vs of t at any particular time, we will have the functional of Vs at t0 at any particular time. Put it in G. Now we are having a functional G of this, which is having a particular dependence over here. Okay, it will depend on the asset price as well as the time tc0. It's a final condition. Once we are having a final condition, we are having a particular functional over here which is dependent on S and tc0. We could again utilize the Black-Scholes methodology, like the particular formula that I had given to you guys, which I also showed in the tutorial. Substitute that final condition that you get to get the value of the compound option. Okay. A chooser option is another exotic option. Okay, it's an option on an option. However, what it does, it instead of it giving you a right to buy one particular option, it is giving you a right to buy between two options. Okay, so the thing is okay, sorry, it's not it basically gives you a right to buy it basically gives you a right to buy some option. So so this is what a chooser option is. Okay, so now the thing is, let us say that at the end, at expiry, we could choose between these two options, V1 and V2. Okay, what are these options? That's not the question. Let us say that these are two particular options dependent upon the underlying, and at a particular time, because they are options, they could be evaluated by the Black-Scholes methodology. Its chooser is also an option. It is based on these two options. The chooser option itself will also have this Black-Scholes equation. These variables will also have the Black-Scholes equation. Okay, so these are the same Black-Scholes equations all of these options will have. Obviously, the Black-Scholes equations that are there are set by the final condition. That will tell you what the solution is. For this option, let us say that both of these are calls. So what we know is that the value of this particular option that is there, if it's a call option, what is the final condition. This is also a call option. Let us say that the exercise price is E2, exercise price this is E1. Both of these you can basically solve. Okay, evaluate because it's a European call with an exercise E1 at time t. Okay, now the thing is, as far as the chooser option goes, it gives you a choice between these two options. Okay, so obviously, if it's giving a choice between these two options, what you will basically say is so what you will basically do is, because there's going to be a choice between these two options, you'll obviously choose the option which is going to have the maximum higher profit. Okay, this option that is there when it is basically getting exercised is this particular value. If you look at the value that this particular option will have, at the value that this particular chooser option will have at expiry will be the maximum value which is possible among these two options. Okay, you'll just choose one of the options and you'll choose an option which is having the maximum value. Okay, which is going to give you the maximum profit. So okay, so as far as these options go, right, V1 as well as V2, okay, these have an expiry which is further away than the expiry at t, which is expiry further away than when this option is basically expiring, the chooser option. The other thing is, as far as this these options go, you get the right to buy these particular options. Okay, as far as the chooser option goes, you get a right to choose between these two options. You have a right to buy this option V1 at price E1. You have a right to buy an option V2 at price E2. Okay, so because of that, in case you want to choose the best possible option, you will choose the option which will give you the highest amount of profit. So you'll basically be choosing the value of this option that is there will be the one which will be the highest possible profit. If you choose V1, the profit you make is V1 minus E1. That is the value of V1 at TCH. If you choose V2, the profit you made is V2 minus E2. Okay, and if both of these are negatives, obviously you're making a zero profit. So you choose the maximum value over here. Okay, so that is how you basically evaluate the final condition for the chooser option. Okay, so the way you will evaluate this option is again the same thing. V1, how to evaluate that? It is expiry somewhere in the future, which is called time T1. Okay, and whatever the whatever the exercise price for that, it's a European call. This also, let us just for example, let us say that this thing is a European call. This is also a European call. It is expiring somewhere in the future. Okay, which is at a time much more higher than TCH. Okay, that these are once you know the final conditions, you can evaluate both these options V1 and V2. You have a particular formula for V1 and V2 from the Black-Scholes equation. Okay, you also have done this in the tutorial as I showed you how you'd get an analytical formula for that. Take that, plug it in over here. Now you'll get a final condition for CH, and then afterwards use the Black-Scholes equation again on that final condition to evaluate the value of this particular chooser option. Okay. Yeah. Another kind of an exotic option is an option which basically gives you a payment. Okay, that is, you're getting paid at a rate LD. You're getting paid at a rate L. Okay, for that is, you will get paid an amount L rupees, LDT rupees every time for every time interval dt that the asset is basically between these two values. Okay, if this is the way the option is, that it is giving you a particular payment for just holding the option when the asset is among these two values, okay, then what you have is, you can just do the whole Black-Scholes framework, and you will only have to do is, have to add this other payment to your portfolio. Okay, that is when the asset is basically between these two values, this particular I that is there is equal to 1 or it is equal to 0 otherwise. Okay, that is what this extra term that is going to be there over here, and the L is basically just the rate at which you're basically getting money inside your portfolio. You put it inside the evaluation of the Black-Scholes evaluation, that is, you construct your portfolio, and then after you hedge it, and then you apply no arbitrage. This extra term will have to be there, and that is the extra addition that comes up in the Black-Scholes equation, and this is how you will get an equation for the Black-Scholes for a range nodes contract. Okay, now what we will be considering are multi-asset options. Okay, multi-asset options are basically options which are not just on one particular asset, but they might be on many assets. Many assets, each of these assets has its own drift, has its own variance. Okay, okay, and as far as this dxi that is there, each of these is equal to each of them are mean 0, and the second second expectation value that is there is equal to dt. However, there is another interesting thing: the fluctuations that are there, okay, in the asset prices, these dxi's, okay, these assets are somehow correlated to each other. Okay, so there is a particular fluctuation. Okay, that is, the fluctuation themselves would basically have a particular correlation. Okay, so if the fluctuations themselves are having a particular correlation, okay, that thing is obviously possible. I mean, you might look at, say, for example, let me just think about it. Let us say that you're looking at a particular price of let us say you're looking at the particular price of oil. Okay, that is petrol. Okay, and you're basically correlating that, how that basically fluctuates. You might be having some other quantity which is basically some other quantity. Let us say let us say something which is utilizing petrol, some industry which is utilizing a lot of petrol to produce its product. Okay, so in case there is an industry that is using petrol to produce a lot of its products, any fluctuating in the petrol price, okay, will basically also imply like some kind of fluctuation possibly in the price of this particular product that is getting produced. Okay, so in that particular case, what you have is that these two fluctuations that are there are themselves correlated. Okay, there is a possibility like that. The example that I gave is like a very naive example, but obviously there could be a case where the product fluctuations are themselves correlated, where the asset fluctuations are themselves correlated. Now, in case you're having some kind of a option, some kind of a portfolio which is dependent upon all of these assets, then if you consider the Pareto lemma, when you're doing the Pareto lemma, what you do is you first consider partial derivative with respect to t and write that with dt. Then you will consider how things change with just partially once you just change ds. Okay, first ds that is there will be multiplied just by dsi. Okay, this thing is just a normal partial derivative. But in case of stochastic quantities, as we had been saying, generally you cannot just ignore ds squared. Okay, because ds squared that is there will contain dx squared, which is having a power which is equal to dt, which is as the same power as this here. So what you generally do, again, as we had said, is that once you're considering ds squared, you just consider whatever you have here ds squared, and whatever evaluation that you have, take just the average values. Okay, so once you take ds squared over here, average value of this is, there will be a squared here, but this is dt squared, you can ignore. You will have a cross product, the average value there, expected value there is equal to 0, and then you will have a product of this by itself. Okay, so then what over here what you have is you will have the expectation value of dxi dxj, which is equal to rho ij. So that is why you have this thing is as rho ij. There will be a sigma si sigma j sj. There is a factor of 1 by 2. Okay, and then there is a second derivative with respect to si sj, and then there is something which is dependent on dt. Okay, so this is how the Pareto lemma would become in case you had many assets for your portfolio, a portfolio which is dependent on many assets. Okay, so now if you are trying to evaluate the option on many underlyings, these options could basically be called basket options, options on baskets, or rainbow options. That is, when options are based on many underlying, it is like, okay, it's a basket of many assets inside. So that's why these assets can have different kind of names like this. Okay, when we'll try to evaluate that, we again construct a portfolio, which is where we try to do the delta hedging. We have our particular option here, then we short these assets in amounts deltas. When we write down the change in the portfolio, okay, what we have is we can write it out as the following. Okay, there will be this stuff minus the delta times dsi. Delta hedging to remove the randomness will basically make d pi be like money. So because it is like money, then you basically just do you basically say that the change that is there is just going to be equal to pi times r dt. That is what this thing has to be equal to in order for there to be no arbitrage possibilities. And then you get this Black-Scholes equation in case you're having multiple assets. Okay, in case we are having dividends, as I had considered for one option, depend on one asset. If I had one dividend, it was an r minus d. In case you had many dividends, you can basically prove that it will this term that is there, which is that was there, will basically be an r minus di summation over I. Okay, so now we will go into an example of a particular multiple asset option. This multiple asset option that I'm going to be talking about is called an exchange option. And the reason I'm just going to go through this option is it will give you an idea about the issue of using the similarity transformation to solve the Black-Scholes equation. Okay, that I had talked in the chapter on partial derivatives. Okay, so exchange options are the one which gives you a right to exchange one asset for another in a predetermined ratio at expiry. Okay, so say like you had two assets. Okay, at expiry what you do have is you could be able to expire q1 fraction of q2 fraction of s2 for q1 fraction of s1. Okay, that means at expiry what you do is you will be either you will be gaining q1 of s1, okay, and you will be losing q2 of s2. So this is the amount of gain that you would basically make. This is the amount of change that you have as far as asset positions go. Since you're having an option and not an obligation, if it's positive, you will basically keep this particular option. That is, you will realize this particular asset change. Otherwise, you will not realize the asset change in case in that particular case your profit is equal to 0. Okay, so in order to solve this kind of a problem, what we do is we can use a similarity reduction. In case we are just having two assets, we can show that we can do a similarity reduction. That is, we define a new variable s1 and s2 and write your v s1 s2 t equal to q1 s2 times a function of this eta, which is s1 divided by s2. Okay, now we need in our equation that we had partial derivatives. We had first derivative and second derivative. Let us see how these first and second derivatives change. When I look at ds1 by del by del s1, it is basically d by d eta by ds1. When I take d eta by ds1 here, I'll just get 1 over s2 for this thing, and then d by d eta it by itself. When I take a partial derivative with respect to s2, I get d by d eta times d eta by ds2. Okay, take the derivative of d eta by ds2, I get minus 1 over s1 by s2 squared, and d by d eta remains. Minus s1 by s2, I write it as eta. So I'm going to get minus eta by s2 d by d eta. When I take a second derivative of d by ds1, okay, what I get is, over here I'm taking a second derivative because there is no there is no, as far as S2 goes, there is no dependent on eta. Okay, so then I will just have as far as this equation goes, and then I will just have this thing as 1 over S2 d by d eta times del of del S1. Okay, but del by del S1 is just 1 over S2 times del by del eta, so that's why I just get this thing as 1 over S2 divided by del eta. So this thing is S2. Okay, if I try del by del S2 squared, I just have del by del S2 over here, so then I get del by del S2 minus S1 divided by S2 del S2 del by del eta. When I take the first derivative, I take the derivative of this, there is only dependence of S2, so that is just 2 divided by S2 cube times S1. Del by del eta is over here. Second time I take the derivative, I'll just basically get minus S1 divided by del S2 del by S2 del by del eta. Okay, this expression that I have, I'll just write this as eta. This thing is S2 squared del by del eta. Over here what I do is I just make a substitution of what minus del by del S2 was. That is this expression. I have this expression, I substitute over here, I get that this thing is just eta squared divided by S2 squared del squared by del eta squared. Okay, finally I have another partial derivative which is S1 S2. I take del by del S2. S1 that was there was 1 by S2 times del by del eta. I take the derivative here. First derivative I take is just this term, which is minus 1 by S2 squared del by del eta. Second derivative I take, I'll get 1 by S2 del by del S2 del by del eta. I just make the substitution of del by del S2 here. I get this thing is minus eta divided by S2 squared S2 squared. Okay. Now the things to note over here. First derivative has coefficient which is going as 1 over S2. When I'm looking at the derivatives, as far as the coefficient goes, the S2 dependence goes, there is going as 1 over S2. Okay, that is how the first derivatives have. If I'm looking at the Black-Scholes equation, whenever there is an S, right, del by del S, it is always multiplied by S. Either it can be S1 or S2. Right, it is getting multiplied either by S1 or S2. I multiply this thing by S1, I will just get an eta. I multiply this thing with S2, if I multiply this thing with S2, I'll get a 1. If I multiply this thing with S1, I get an eta. If I multiply this thing with S2, I get a 1. If I multiply this thing with S1, I get an eta squared. So all I get is basically, I get the whole first term that is there, first derivatives that are there. In the Black-Scholes equation, the S2 term basically drops out. Okay, because I'll be multiplying either by an S1 and S2, and then I either will get an eta squared or I'll get a 1. So the S2 dependence drops out. Similarly, when I'm considering second derivatives, the second derivatives come with S1 S2 multiplications or S2 squared or S1 squared. Okay, the denominators that are there as far as S1 S2 goes, the second derivatives that are there, all of them have an S2 squared at the denominator. There's an S2 squared here in the denominator, S2 squared here in the denominator, S2 squared here in the denominator. Okay, if I just multiply this each of this by S1 squared, any one of this by S1 squared, I will just get an eta squared. If I multiply it by S1 S2, then I will have S1 S2 divided by S2 squared, that is again just eta. And if I just multiply by S2 squared, the S2 squared just totally disappears. So the whole idea is that in this particular expression, okay, if I'm in this particular expression, okay, so this is what I've written, if I multiply the expression by S1, I'll get an eta. If I multiply S2, I'll just get a 1. When I'm having second derivatives is S squared. If I multiply S1 squared, I get an eta. S1 S2, I get an eta squared, eta. S2 squared, I get a 1. So the whole idea is that you will never the S dependence that is there is completely removed from this expression. All you're getting is the eta dependence. And then if you can just play around with the expression, what you get is you will be getting an equation like this. So it's basically a Black-Scholes equation where the sigma prime is this term. It's a Black-Scholes equation where the variance is sigma prime, the interest rate is substituted by d1, and the dividend that was there is substituted by d2. Okay, so this thing is a normal Black-Scholes equation. You know the final condition that is there for this particular expression is given by this. Okay, so at the final case what you have is that this thing is the value of the final condition. Okay, and the reason that was the reason that you wrote it as this way, because 1 second, 1 minute, just a sec. Yeah, that was the reason that you wrote this expression in such a way so that the final condition that is there you could write it as S1 divided by S2 Q1. Okay, you could have taken this, you basically write this as S2 maximum of 1 second, just a sec, we'll just erase this. Yeah, sorry, you could write this as S2 times max of Q1 eta minus Q2 0. Okay, so because of that what you see is that the final condition that is there, there is a Q2 written, Q1 written over here, but you could just plug that in over here. If I want I can just do that here itself so that it's more clear. There's Q1 here, Q1 S2, and this thing is Q1 divided by Q2. Okay, Q1 S2, Q1 divided by Q2. So what you see is that the similarity reduction, because of the similarity reduction we have chosen it to be a form like this because that basically matches up to the final form, that is that time t equal to the expiry. What you have is the expiry value that is there is just given by Q1 S2 h eta times tau is basically just max of eta minus Q1 divided by Q2 times Q1 S2. So that means at expiry what I have is h of eta times tau at expiry is just max of eta minus Q2 divided by Q1 comma 0. Okay, so this is the final condition you have on h. Okay, you're having a final condition on h. You're basically having a Black-Scholes equation over here. You're having a second order differential equation, partial differential equation for h, which is just like having the Black-Scholes form. You can basically solve for h, and that is how you can evaluate the option.